I'm Todd MacKay. This is the Canadian Taxpayers Podcast, and we're dedicated to lower taxes, less waste, and more accountable government. But we've got an important interview for you today. Brian Sauvé is the president of the National Police Federation, and that's the union that represents the RCMP. And we asked him to join us today because we've got a lot of questions about the federal policy to ban and buy back hundreds of guns and types of guns. So, Brian, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thanks for having us, Todd. It's an important topic to all Canadians, and from our perspective, it's definitely brought up a lot of conversation in Canada.
For sure. I want to get into the policy. There's all kinds of details in there that are interesting to a lot of people. But first of all, I think you've got a really interesting perspective because not only do you lead the RCMP union, you've also been a police officer, and that started a long time ago. I was checking out your bio. And you referred to somebody who inspired you back in the day when you were a kid, who you referred to as Super Cop. Who was that? And how did that go?
Well, I don't have permission to share the name, but my father was a high school teacher his entire career, and one of his students' father was a police officer in the Montreal Police Service. And as he was going through high school, actually, he was shot in the back. But his reputation within the Montreal Police Service his nickname was Super Cop. So an inspiration for me, definitely. Unfortunately, at the time, my mom had that experience. And when I thought about going down this career path, she said, kind of over my dead body. So I did what every teenager does, and I moved 4 provinces away. And then did some other stuff and eventually joined the RCMP.
I bring that up because for me, looking at policy, it's a policy issue. It's not something I've never run the risk of being shot. I've never worried about that. But for you, that was something that you saw when you were a kid with this person in your neighborhood as a police officer. What is it like to just deal with that possibility? And what's it like personally to worry about firearms in that sense?
Well, I think, I'm still a serving police officer, obviously not in an operational capacity daily showing up with a uniform in this particular role. But our membership, it's a unique scenario in the public safety field, whether you're a firefighter, whether you're a frontline paramedic or a correctional services officer or a police officer. Every day, the goal is to come home to your family. And we don't know, it's less prevalent in Canada versus the gun culture in the United States. But there is always that risk that, one call will just go south very, very, very quickly. As we saw in Calgary just 2 weeks ago, a week and a half ago, with Andrew Harnett. A lot of people talk about routine traffic stops. There's no such thing in the policing world. They're some of the most high-risk activities that we do, mainly because of all the unknowns, and that can result in fatality fairly quickly. So firearms are a concern for police officers, and the responsible use of firearms and ownership of firearms in Canada is obviously a concern for police officers in Canada. But at the same time, responsible enforcement and prioritization of that enforcement, which for your audience actually is funded by Canadian taxpayers, of which all police officers in Canada are. So we want to see responsible use of the money that comes off of our paychecks on a daily basis to ensure that Canadians live happy, safe, and healthy lives.
Yeah, for sure. And I think a lot of us, appreciate so much the work you do so that we don't have to worry about those kind of things. I want to go to sort of the genesis of this particular policy when it really kicked off, I guess. Obviously, there was a situation in Nova Scotia. Constable Heidi Stephenson and 21 others were murdered. Where were you when you heard the news, and how did that hit you?
I was in Vancouver at the time, and it was probably about 5 o'clock in the morning, Vancouver time, when we started getting information. There was we have a very good working relationship with the commissioner and the chain of command in the RCMP, even though we're independent of that. So we had received information on the ground. People had reached out to us about the evolving scenario, and then as details came about throughout that Sunday morning, we obviously had the sad news of Heidi being killed, and then also Chad Morrison being injured and in the hospital for treatment amongst the 21 other victims in Portapique and Colchester County. Difficult day for, I think, a lot of Canadians, and definitely those in the Atlantic region, as well as our members. And I think what people forget is that in Atlantic Canada, I'd say almost as much as the prairies, there's an extremely tight-knit community mindset. And our membership immerse themselves very much so in those communities. They're hockey coaches, figure skating coaches, baseball volunteers, curling, all of that stuff. So when you talk about 22 victims, including Heidi, we have to remember that a lot of the other 1,000 members that we have in Nova Scotia were friends and colleagues or co-workers or had spouses who were co-workers of some of the other 21. So there's a magnification of that impact. Not only did they lose a colleague, but they lost friends in that massacre. So it was a defining day, definitely, for Nova Scotia, Atlantic Canada, and Canadians altogether.
I think when all of us saw that, whenever you see a huge tragedy like that, that one thought just starts to come through your head: we've got to do something, and one of the toughest parts is being helpless or feeling helpless. You want to do something. Obviously, the federal government felt that it needed to do something. So it rolled out a massive new gun policy. I'm wondering, you can probably explain it better than I can. What does that new policy look like in terms of the gun ban and buyback?
Well, yeah. How does it translate to ordinary everyday Canadians? One day you had a bunch of firearm owners in Canada who have gone through all of the hoops in Canada, and there are a lot of them, in order to qualify, have their criminal record checks, pay the license fees, go through the training to possess and acquire and safely store and safely use a number of firearms. The next day, all of those guns will become unlawful to possess. Not all of them, but a lot of them. And we will be entering into, who knows when, there's a number of tenders out there through the federal government to manage the buyback program, where those firearms owners will be offered the opportunity to either decommission and keep a non-workable firearm in their collection, or to have it bought back by the federal government at whatever. It may be pennies on the dollar, it may be the current market value. We're not sure what that's going to look like. And that was done through order in council, versus the normal process of modifying legislation, which provides for tabling legislation, first readings, second readings, committee appearances, witnesses who are subject matter experts or who might be impacted by that legislation having their say, and then ultimately moving over to the Senate, repeating the process, and going back to the House to pass that legislation. So, one could argue that it was a reactive decision to April 18th and April 19th that the government chose to go this route, because they didn't have, for example, the Canadian Taxpayers Federation may have had an interest in providing testimony at the Parliamentary Committee or at the Senate Committee to talk about how much this is going to cost Canadians. We don't know yet. They budgeted, I think, $200 million. And, if we go back to the Firearms Registry Online, it started out at a multi-million-dollar project and ended up as a multi-billion-dollar project. So there's a lot of interested parties with respect to this that didn't have their say. And I think that's some of the concern from Canadians. I'm not saying, and we are not saying that we support gun ownership. What we are saying is that we support fair, transparent, evidence-driven decisions by government that are going to really address a problem in society. And that's the root behind this position paper, is it's really to shine a spotlight on gun violence in Canada, and where does those guns come from, and should we be devoting our tax dollars through the government to perhaps stem the tide of where those guns are coming from, perhaps increase enforcement before we go down the regulation process to impact everyday Canadians that have gone through all the regulatory steps to own and possess firearms.
One of the key factors here is a term that's in the media a lot. My impression is, I think a lot of people interpret this term differently. So I want to throw it out to you. What exactly is a military style assault rifle?
It's not defined in the regulations, nor in the criminal code or anything. I think it's a colloquial term that has been adopted probably from movies like Rambo and the Terminator and modern media. People see an AR-15 or an M16 from the Vietnam era, for example, and they interpret that as a military style assault rifle. I think what they're meaning to get to is guns that are designed for military purposes, and trying to apply that overarching colloquialism to any semi-automatic or a rifle that might be in the marketplace today. But assault rifle is not a classification. And really, we should be speaking about the specifics in the regulations or in the law about where guns are classified. So is it a semi-automatic rifle? Is it an automatic rifle? Is it a rimfire rifle? Is it a centerfire rifle? Those types of things versus using colloquial terms that really have no bearing in law.
And maybe I'll throw this one out there. I think when a lot of people, it's interesting. I was talking to a friend that I grew up with, and explained that those guns you see in Rambo and stuff, they're pretty hard to get in Canada. Why is that? When you're talking about a gun where you can just hold the trigger down and let it go, how available are those in Canada?
They're not. In fact, automatic rifles where you can just pull the trigger and go nuts are prohibited in Canada. There are a few out there, I'm not sure the exact number, which have been grandfathered into possession for certain people who've had them for a long time, but you can't buy one. And in fact, to modify a semi-automatic rifle into an automatic rifle is a criminal offense under the law in Canada today.
Right. And I believe that law has been on the books since the late 70s, if I recall correctly.
Yeah. It has.
So I don't want to get into too many technicalities, but I'm going to throw one out to you.
Sure.
One of the firearms that are banned under the new order in council is the Ruger Mini 14. One of the firearms that's not banned is the SKS, which is a very prominent, or a lot of those are out there. Popular. A lot of folks have. Yeah, popular. That's the word I'm looking for. So let me put it to you. Ruger Mini 14, SKS. One is banned, one isn't. Which one is more dangerous?
Well, they're both designed to kill. So, a gun is a gun is a gun in my book, and from a policeman's perspective, whether it's a .38 revolver or 9mm semi-automatic or .308 rimfire rifle or an AR-15 with a high-capacity magazine, they're all designed to kill. They all provide a threat to police officers. So, Ruger Mini 14 or SKS, immaterial. The Ruger Mini 14 obviously contains an emotional component to Canadians, because that was what was used at the École Polyvalente in 1989. But at the same time, as semi-automatic rifles, they are restricted and or prohibited depending on their capacity for ownership. So I'd have to say we have to look at where the Ruger Mini 14 or the SKS that is being used in a crime came from. And how did that person, lawful gun owner or not, if it's a lawful gun owner, did they slip through the system? Do we have weaknesses in our ownership and training and legislation to allow that person to maintain possession of that firearm? Non-lawful gun owner, how did we as Canadians allow a criminal to get possession of such a powerful firearm?
I want to get to the wider issue of gun crime in just a moment, but before we leave this specific policy, I want to ask a question that I think everybody would ask when you think back to what happened in Nova Scotia. Would this policy have prevented that tragedy?
Not in Nova Scotia. The majority of the guns that were used in Nova Scotia were not obtained legally.
I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. It's not just about doing something, it's about doing the right thing. Which brings me to, let's define the problem a little bit, and you've alluded to it already. What kinds of guns are typically used in gun crime in Canada?
Well, if you look at through our position paper, actually, there's some interesting data within there, and Canada has a really good relationship with the United States. Although the non-essential travel, and I have some friends who've chosen to winter in Florida because just of the weather and such. But we have grown up with this ability to cross the border to get less expensive gas or milk and come back should we decide to live close to the border, and the majority of the Canadian population does. It's the largest undefended border in the world. But the United States is also the world's largest manufacturer of small arms in the world. And what we have seen, and the data supports this, is that the majority of gun crime in Canada is committed with illegal firearms that are traced back to the United States. So if we're talking about what kind of guns commit the majority of crimes, it's those that are obtained illegally and are not registered in Canada and not possessed by legal firearms owners.
Right. And in this case, the gun ban and buyback, it's taking guns from licensed gun owners, but that doesn't change criminals' access to guns if they're primarily getting them from the States. Am I understanding that correctly?
100%. And, as police officers often joke about whether or not a criminal will follow a firearms law while they're about to commit a crime. I mean, there's a little bit of a double entendre or joke in there, right? I'm going to rob a bank, so I'm going to commit a crime. Do I really care as the criminal that my gun was obtained legally or illegally? Probably not. So.
One of the major issues is gang violence. That's something you talked about in your position paper. How big an issue is that?
It's a growing issue in Canada. In fact, in the lower mainland of British Columbia, where I've done all of my services as a police officer, it seems to go in spikes up and down, and they're on an upward trend at the moment with gang and gun violence. This particular position paper was released when it was released the second week of December or November. Mainly because of the 12-year-old that was killed by gunfire in downtown Toronto as a result of gun and gang violence. So we thought it was timely to bring this attention to Canadians, that it's not so much your hunter in Meadowvale, Saskatchewan, that has 4 to 5 rifles, maybe a pistol or 2, all obtained legally through the proper regulations, that we have to worry about as Canadians. Now, do we have to talk about the classification of firearms and what firearms should be able to be legally obtained in Canada? I think that's a worthy discussion to have between legislators and interested parties. But really, shouldn't we be focusing on where those bullets are coming from in public and how those firearms were obtained? I don't know if they've established this yet in the killing of that 12-year-old in Toronto, but I can probably surmise that that gun was not obtained legally and not registered. And the owner, or the person who fired that round that killed that 12-year-old boy, most probably did not possess a possession acquisition certificate, did not go through the training that any lawful firearms owner in Canada would go through. And that's something that Canadians should really be focused on.
So to sort of summarize your points, a lot of the gun problems in Canada are with smuggled guns coming in from the United States illegally. A lot of it ends up with gang violence. That's another major issue that you note in your position paper. But this policy doesn't seem to address those issues, at least very directly. It doesn't seem to be hitting the right target. But coming back to sort of what we were talking about earlier, all of us still had that feeling we've got to do something. We want to make things better. I think one of the interesting things about your policy paper is that you have a number of recommendations to try to deal with the issues that frontline RCMP officers are seeing in the field. What are those recommendations?
Well, there's a number of them, right? We talk about the Canadian Firearms Program. And really, for the best use of legislative powers to increase the ability for that Canadian enforcement agency to be able to trace firearms, to be able to bring them back to where they came from. We talk about border integrity, right? The RCMP works with a number of partners such as the CBSA, the ATF in the United States, as well as corrections and police of local jurisdiction here in Canada, to really look at that undefended border and target areas where there may be weaknesses. The RCMP, for example, we do a lot around Roxham Road in Quebec, where that highway of refugees has been coming through. Windsor Detachment is one of the busiest border crossings in Canada, and they're experiencing some staffing shortages through the RCMP, as well as a reprioritization of those particular members. Evidence-based policy changes. So yes, lawful gun owners in Canada need the ability to ensure that, Canadians should have confidence that lawful gun owners in Canada are properly licensed, trained, background checks are done, and storage is in proper ways. Because I have seen, as a police officer, gone to a break and enter of a couple who's away on a weekend, and guns that were legally possessed have been stolen. So it's possible that those guns could be sold on the black market or used in the commission of a crime. So we need to know, as Canadians, that if my neighbor has guns, that they are stored properly, that they are secure, that there really is very little risk to someone who breaks into the house being able to steal them unless they take away the 700-pound safe that they're in. That really needs to be an ongoing conversation, and it shouldn't be a one-time deal where we say these are the requirements, because things change. But that needs to go that route. And we need to talk about funding. So whether it's funding of integrated border enforcement teams, whether it's funding of different law enforcement agencies through the RCMP Firearms Program, the National Weapons Enforcement Support Team, whether it's funding for intelligence services to assist in identifying those funnels or criminal organizations that are sending guns north, that's kind of where I think we should be prioritizing before we start talking about modifying regulations of the legally obtained firearms in Canada.
Yeah, when we did analysis on it, we looked at the amount of funding that was likely to go into this. The Liberal platform referred to $200 million. We've seen those estimates from the government getting ballparked in the $600 million range. We've seen others. We've talked to some of our counterparts in New Zealand, Based on that, we're guessing that it's going to go well over $1 billion. But even if you look at that low ball estimate of 200 million, we ballpark that out. That could put a lot more RCMP members at the border dealing with gun issues. And that seems like if you come back to that do something question, that seems like a way to make Canadians safer rather than taking guns away from law-abiding and licensed gun owners. Are we on the right track there? What are your thoughts?
I think you're on the right track there. You know, the part of the conversation that hasn't come up yet, or really hasn't been delved into, is the do something is the community engagement. It's the do something of where are we as Canadians failing those who find it more attractive to go into the criminal lifestyle or the gang lifestyle versus not. So does that mean we need better social programs for after school? Does that mean we need better healthcare provisions for those who are at risk in marginalized communities? Does that mean that we need a better social network as a community across Canada? But all those things take money. And it's a difficult conversation to have and to bring up because as taxpayers, none of us like to pay more taxes, bluntly put, and all of these things would be downloaded to us as Canadians. However, you know, in the society that we have as Canadians, what we do is we help each other.
So I think that's coming to the end of the questions that I had for you. It was very helpful to go through this, but I am curious a little bit. You mentioned your mother was not happy about you becoming a police officer or getting a motorbike. Did she ever come around on any of that?
Well, she came around on the police side. Yes. I waited about 10 years or so to join the RCMP, and she did come around. She didn't come around on the motorcycle side.
Well, 1 out of 2 ain't bad.
1 out of 2 is not bad.
Well, thank you so much for chatting with us. Thank you for putting out a policy paper like this. It's not easy to be critical of a policy or provide recommended alternatives, but from our view, we really saw this as an important part of the conversation to show if we need to do something, there may be a better way to do it. That money could be better spent in other ways, and it was really helpful to chat with you about that. Obviously, the Canadian Taxpayers Federation is opposing this policy. We're joining some of the court fights to fight this policy. For folks out there who'd like to know more, check out taxpayer.com. But Brian, again, thank you so much for joining us today.
No, thank you, Todd. Always appreciate it, and enjoy the rest of your week.
For sure.